For RCR Wireless News, my name is Sean Kinney, and today we're going to catch up with Werner Sievers, the president and CEO of Nextivity, to talk a little bit about the in-building wireless market, which is obviously a very dynamic niche in the telecom space right now. So Werner, thank you so much for taking the time today.
Absolute pleasure, Sean. Great to be speaking again.
So I use the term in-building wireless. That's a very buzzy kind of word, but it's a bit nebulous and it encompasses a lot of different solution types. So before we really get into this, let's kind of talk a little bit more specifically about what exactly we're talking about from a building perspective. The Middleprise is really where the battleground is right now, and I think you could aptly define that as spaces between 100,000 and 500 square feet. So tell me, how does Nextivity fit into the in-building wireless in the Middleprise market?
Well, as you so eloquently point out, the term, each building is certainly a thing unto itself, firstly, and then, the term Middleprise is probably the most overtraded term in the industry right now. But its indication, or its purpose, I guess its purpose in life really is to indicate those venue sizes that aren't of the classic big iron million square foot nature. And if one sort of steps that down just a little, one comes up with a number which is anywhere from, perhaps 50,000 or 100,000 to 500,000 square feet. But having said that, it really does heavily depend on the type of venue. For example, hospitals are quite different to apartment complexes, are quite different to hospitality or hotel environments. And then secondly, the skill of the installer also has a profound influence on really how big you can make a venue function well, compellingly, by using a certain class of technology. And then finally, there is this other dimension which says that, where is the signal source? Is the signal source dedicated and inside of the building? Or really is the signal source outside, and does one have to do the very best that one can? So those three circumstances or considerations create a waxing and a waning really of this term. But, one could concur that 100,000 to 500,000 describes the Middleprise. At Nextivity, however, and particularly in terms of QUATRA, we tend to sort of take that a step down, and we tend to speak of 15,000 to 500,000 square foot. And then depending upon how these three components work out or how they influence the venue, we can go larger than 500,000 square foot. In terms of the types of buildings, really what we're seeing right now for our particular product and our offering and the integrators that we're active with, hospitals, healthcare in general, hospitals specifically, different class hospitals and different grade hospitals, these are all really at the top of our list, and it seems like they'll be there for a while. Hospitality in general and hotels specifically, motels all the way through boutique hotels to even the tier one large multi-story hotels, that is turning out to be actually more sort of demanding and more aggressive and more profitable for QUATRA than we initially imagined. And then, of course, one begins to scale down through the balance of verticals, as it were. Enterprise office environments, the large ones belong into the top, should we say, 10 tech brands. Those are turning out to be, exceptionally busy, as it were. Government and sort of contracting environments. Of course, the manufacturing and the warehouse spacing, they don't belong together, but so manufacturing certainly is a very active space for us, sometimes because of the grave degree of difficulty in creating coverage, compelling coverage throughout. Warehouses, for sure. I mean, Amazon and many other warehousing entities today are putting significant reliance on in-building coverage. And then I would say towards the sort of bottom of the stack, very important, safety considerations, but parking garages tend to be also a very, a significant contribution to the resource base that the system integrators have today.
Okay, so those are a lot of high value verticals that are very much shaping the way vendors approach the in-building space. Werner, you mentioned Quatra, which is Nextivity's solution for this kind of middle price area. Can you tell us a little bit more about Quatra compares to some of the other solution sets that you see on the market, like passive DAS, active DAS, or even a small cell DAS hybrid?
Well, I think when, as one tries to raise the issue of different technologies for various applications, and then those costs associated with those applications, ultimately one needs to sort of contain the element of cost, because cost for everyone, for every manufacturer in the industry, cost is a primary consideration. And the cost is, generally spread amongst three components. There's often a fourth referred to, but generally speaking, it's three components that one needs to consider. It's the capital equipment cost of the active components, the head ends as they're normally referred to, or the remote units. In our case, it would be the network units and the coverage units. Of course, there's the cable cost. In many instances, it's coaxial cable. In some instances, on very large venues, it's fiber optic cable. And then the cable that we've elected to use, which is Cat5 or Cat6 cable. So that is a very representative piece of the cost. And then, of course, that last component is labor. And from a labor point of view, the labor associated with installing fiber is higher than it is to install coaxial, which is higher in turn to install Cat5 or Cat6 cable. So if you consider that the plan, the strategy, the race for all the classic DAS vendors and everybody trying to address in-building, it's probably twofold. It's to adjust or bring down the cost implications of the past, where cost has been significant, but there have been, should we say, operators and carriers that have been willing to subsidize significant in-building costs from a DAS point of view. As we've discussed before, Sean, those days have changed. There is definitely a shift away from subsidization to the enterprise or the company burdening the cost. And as one sort of looks at that, cost is the primary implication. The other implication is, how do you scale up a labor pool with enough skill set to be able to go out there and install sufficient enough pace to actually match the demand that exists today. So if you consider that our primary target is the installer base, the system integrator is actually our primary installer, our primary interface with the customer, and we empower essentially the system integrator to be competitive in his or her, in their environment. That is our primary job here, is to try and make the system integrators as efficient as they possibly can be. And what that then automatically does is it creates a balancing effect in terms of the cost consideration. If you have a look at Quatra, which is a hybrid active DAS technology, and you compare it to the implications of equipment cost, cable cost, and labor cost, we're lower, significantly lower on all counts, on all instances. So the reality there, however, is that the idea isn't to prove that we're any more or less costly than, for example, one of our competitive vendors on either one of those counts. It's the system integrator who bids a project, and that project has a cost implication. And if you can make the system integrator as cost efficient as possible, because perhaps the hardware or the active components of the system cost less, the cable costs less, and he's willing to install it at a labor rate which is lower than perhaps somebody else's or not, he ultimately defines what is digestible and what's competitive at the customer interface. So I think I've seen cost take on an inappropriate sort of profile in the industry, because generally what's happening is that vendors are making statements about the cost of their product. They can achieve X amount of dollars per square foot, and sometimes labor is included, sometimes labor is excluded. Normally, cable cost is included, but sometimes it is excluded. So the enigma of sort of CapEx cost in the space of ours is somewhat suspect in some circumstances. Hopefully that answered your question.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that was a great breakdown of some of the drivers of the CapEx piece. But Werner, once the system integrator has been into this enterprise space, has installed the system and commissioned it, once that's up and running, are there any variables that the actual enterprise owner needs to take into account that would relate to the operational costs of that system?
There certainly are. And again, I think there's three primary considerations. Is there an in-building signal source at that particular venue? And does it necessitate a dedicated backhaul of some description, normally some kind of enterprise-grade DSL line or whatever it may be? Then there's the implication of effective remote management. Can the entire infrastructure in the venue be managed remotely so as not to cause the need for any truck roll in the event that there's failure? And then thirdly, and this is a little bit of a legacy of the past, the passive DAS systems tend to require optimization over time. Circumstances change within a building. Buildings are subject to renovation, and perhaps the renovation doesn't necessarily directly impact the location of cables or antennas, but just the building nature changes. Perhaps walls that were could be penetrated before can now not be penetrated. There are various factors which determine the personality of a building over time. And if you have a very passive, rather rigid system, what does happen is that you have to roll a truck of some description or another. You have to get a technician or an installer, and they need to manually re-optimize the system. So if you take those three issues into account, they really are the ones that determine whether or not you are going to have a busy time and consume a fair amount of money servicing that product, or being forced to charge a customer for repetitive optimization. In the case of QUATRA, as I think you and I have discussed in the past informally, our primary objective was to design a system that would enable someone, a reseller, an installer, a system integrator, to be competitive in their marketplace. And I don't believe it's possible today to have an onerous obligation on any install in a venue, because that removes or eradicates the sort of profitability that, to a large extent, eradicates the profitability of a large venue. So QUATRA will couple to a signal source. It'll partner with a small cell, thereby creating a supercell. And that supercell obviously is something that we've promulgated now for quite a while. We're also, we've moved to a significantly sophisticated level with our diagnostic platform, our management platform, which is a cloud-based platform, and we'll probably discuss that a little later in some detail. And then because of the nature and the intelligence of our system, there is no need for us to do any manual type of optimization, recalculation of the losses involved in an infrastructure in a building. So on all counts, once you've installed our class of technology, there really isn't a need to go back and roll a truck unless you have a hardware failure. And I think that's bringing the OpEx side of what classically used to be a reasonably intensive OpEx cost down to a minimal.
Werner, you talked a little bit about signal source there. That's a kind of a huge differentiator in these different kind of in-building wireless systems. Is the RF signal source being locally generated, or is it a signal that's being captured from the macro layer, then amplified inside a building? In that latter case, where the in-building signal is dependent on the relationship with the macro network, how do you best work with carriers to make sure that there's not any kind of interference issue associated with that?
Yeah, I mean, you've struck a sensitive key with, you know, a number of manufacturers and in fact a number of operators. Traditionally, there has always been this concern that irresponsible application of in-building venues, not taking into account things like capacity and the nature of the number of base stations that can be seen from a location inside of a building, you know, has created a legacy of trauma all around. If you have a look at what we've done, today we're approved by almost 200 or just over 200 operators around the globe. And that roughly is in about 100 countries. What that necessitates is that you've gotten approval from a carrier to at least operate your equipment on their spectrum. Normally it's worded something like XXX product is approved for utilization on XX carrier's network. And if you look at the sort of country implication, 100 countries represents the fact that we've gotten approval from 100 governments or 100 authorities like the FCC in each one of those countries. So before we can do any kind of install, you know, whether that's domestically or internationally, but let's just speak at an international level, because the nature and the model of the in-building wireless model as a whole is sort of moving internationally, even though in the US here we've made, you know, far greater steps than perhaps the rest of the world have. Ofcom now in the UK is to a large extent following the FCC's model, and we'll see deregulation of much of that regulated industry take place, you know, very likely this month. It'll be formally announced this month. And then we'll see the EU over time will adopt much of possibly what the UK has done. So in years to come, we'll sort of see a market that looks more like the United States does, as opposed to the United States being quite an exception. So back to my point about having achieved or obtained 200 approvals from carriers and 100 approvals from government regulators, you would imagine that our product has been, you know, has gone through a rigorous sort of apprenticeship, as you would, over the last number of years. And because QUATRA in particular, but all our products, are unconditionally network safe, that means that on those networks that they've been approved by those governments and by those carriers, we're guaranteeing our customer base that the installation of a product like ours will not cause any interference. And so there's a degree of calmness, if you could put it that way, when the Cel-Fi brand is mentioned by any of the install teams. There is a strong degree of calmness about the credibility that Cel-Fi and or QUATRA have. So that's one of the soft issues that really give us a preferential or gives the operator a preferential sort of peace of mind. The fact that we truly are intelligent on the edge of the network means that this self-organizing intelligence really enables us to, you know, almost guarantee that there'll be no interference whatsoever, even in some rather unusual, perhaps complicated situations. So I think that's one of the primary degrees of comfort that one gets when you've developed a product and you've developed silicon, as we have, that is so customized to running on carrier networks that, you know, even when we go into the labs inside of a carrier to be approved, it now takes weeks as opposed to months. Sometimes it takes days to get approved, just because there's a reputation and a very large, you know, referenceable database of carriers, and of course many of them speak to one another, and they're able to sort of get comfort there. One of the big issues, however, and I think you allude to it strongly in your question, is the responsibility of our integrators and those installers that are designing networks and installing networks to be responsible about which technology class they use in a particular building venue. And of course, you know, that really requires experience and skill depth. And normally the biggest consideration for an installer, a designer, an integrator is to really try and, you know, subject to a site survey and the regular measurements that might be taken at a venue, is to make a determination of the usage of this building. So how will this coverage be utilized or overutilized? And that will determine whether or not one forcibly has to bring a small cell in and then couple that small cell to a QUATRA system to create a supercell, or whether or not you have more than enough margin to operate off the base station. So under the QUATRA banner, there are a number of tools that our installers can use. There, of course, are independent tools, measuring equipment that one can use to determine the nature and usage, cellular usage of bandwidth inside of a building, and try and measure that up to the available off-air capacity. It's not, there's some rules of thumb in terms of how perhaps some installers address it. If you have more than X people in a building, that could determine whether or not you need additional capacity brought on by a small cell. If you're in a very large venue, for example, a warehouse that typically is only manned by 10 or 20 people, that can readily be driven, can readily be serviced by an off-air system. So that responsibility really shifts to the installers, and those competent installers that have been, doing RF type installs for a long time understand the sort of delicate balance between how far you can burden an off-air application versus going to a small cell. And I think it's becoming better and better. It's becoming easier and easier with the additional tools, and the installers and integrators are becoming smarter and more experienced in terms of being readily being able to make that decision.
Yeah, you make a great point there, Werner. We talked earlier about the wide degree of variability that is in the Middleprise market in terms of building use and building type. So it's definitely drives home the point that planning is a key step before you make any sort of major investment in an in-building system. Something that you touched on earlier relative to QUATRA was about the scalability across a big chunk of square footage. Can you tell us a little bit more about how Nextivity can handle different size spaces and effectively scale up the coverage footprint?
Yes. So one should, I should possibly go back and just say that prior to evaluating a venue, one needs to kind of look at the kind of venue, the size of the venue. And of course, as I mentioned before, there are a number of tools that are really available, and there are tools well-known, well-utilized, well-respected tools like IvyWave. We always recommend that a venue is properly surveyed, and we have a tool, the BOM estimator tool, which enables an installer, an integrator, once they've surveyed a building, to very readily get a sense of the magnitude of active hardware that needs to be installed in that building. And then, of course, one would cycle through a number of issues in terms of antenna pointing, and we have tools in our system that enable very intelligent antenna pointing, so that we're just not pointing at base stations which are producing respectable levels of signal, but that we're also measuring the quality of that signal and the loading on that particular base station. So the trick when you're installing an off-air system certainly is to make sure that you don't pick perhaps the most obvious base station as the server, only to find out subsequently that this was the least or the most overloaded and least sort of serviceable base station. So there are a number of tools, and all of those sit sort of then under our Wave cloud-based platform, which again I can address a little later. In terms of the scalability, it truly is all about scalability. So I think at a very general level, we like to divide our scalability into sort of two pieces. The one piece which includes a dedicated signal, in-building signal source, and then those ones that look towards the off-air server as a host. And in the supercell context, if one really looks at the size of buildings that one can address, as soon as you bring in capacity, you can do much more than if capacity is deficient. And if you were to look at the definition of our definition of a Middleprise, as I've said to you before, is sort of 15,000 square foot to say 500,000 square foot. But I've also suggested that there's an element of softness on the upper end of that. And I've also suggested that a lot of that has to do with the skill set of the installer, and also whether or not one's bringing capacity to the equation or not. So the major component, the sort of capacity or the scalar function, or the scalar device, let's rather call it, in our architecture is the network unit. If you have a large venue, you have a larger number of NUs. If you have a smaller building, you have a smaller number of NUs. So in a 15,000 square foot building, for example, you only require one NU or one network unit. Call that our head-end device. And then we can scale all the way from 15,000 square foot through 500,000 square foot by bringing on small cells and by bringing in more network units. And so you can have multiple network units connecting to multiple small cells. And we limit the remote units, we call them coverage units. We limit our network units speaking to 4 remote units, just so that we can prevent any capacity constraints or any other architectural issues. So as I say, for a small venue, you would really size it by virtue of how many NUs you need. For a large venue, you would size it by the number of NUs you would need, and that number would be higher. And the sort of influencing factor in between is, can you successfully or compellingly, without any risk of interference, can you do this off air, or do you need to couple this to a small cell and create supercells? And as I think we've chatted before, our definition of a supercell is when you take a small cell and you couple that directly to multiple NUs, or you take multiple small cells and you couple that to multiple NUs, and then those NUs respectively speak to their remote units, or as we call them, coverage units. And what that creates is this uniform access to capacity throughout the building with no risk of interference. So as I say, the sort of expandability or the scalability of this is really governed by a device or a component in our architecture called the network unit. That's the sort of master, and you can take many of these masters and simply parallel them up, and you end up with a very large venue. So that gives you scalability from quite a modest in-building environment to a significant environment. And that's sort of architecturally where I think we have the edge on many manufacturers right now, and it's evidenced by the enthusiasm of the installer community. It really just is that ability to scale across a broad spectrum and to empower the system integrators with the ability to use that capability as effectively and efficiently as they can, so that in fact they can bid as competitively as possible in their marketplace.
So Werner, for the end user of the system, once they've looked at their coverage and capacity needs, selected a solution, and brought that up and running, what about the network management piece? I know you referenced a cloud service earlier in our conversation. How is a Nextivity approaching network management systems?
Thank you for that question. We started the development of our cloud-based platform called Wave in 2014, and we've aggressively been, augmenting and maturing that product throughout our product offering. So every one of our products, whether they be for mobile applications or whether they be for even residential applications, and very specifically for large enterprise environments like QUATRA, we have a consistent thread of manageability throughout that. And the crux of that, the platform of that, is Wave. And it's based upon Microsoft's Azure IoT cloud platform. And there's a good reason why we chose that product. And really it relates to the carrier grade nature of the product and also the security. The more and more carriers that QUATRA gets installed by or gets installed in conjunction with, the more and more we're finding the need to meet the security applications, the data security requirements of carriers is becoming quite severe. And as you would imagine, not only our product, but our company needs to comply with those data security requirements. So it's an international need. There's probably nowhere in the world where you can sort of get away without being less secure. And the Microsoft Azure platform, by virtue of its nature, certainly is a very, very reliable and trustworthy sort of agent in terms of collecting data and holding data. Of course, there are times when our management platform needs to act as a servant to a larger management system, typically inside of an operator. Some very large enterprise environments, industrial environments, have their own flavor of network management. And so what we do is provide APIs to provide access from our management so that it can live with under, should we say, a master SNMP type management system or other type management system, the likes of which there are at least 3 or 4, well-recognized such systems. So we really afford our installers the ability to manage their installs. We offer the customers, the end user customers, we offer them the ability to manage their indoor environment. And then, of course, if needed, if it's a subsidized system, we can also offer the operator to manage our systems underneath or subservient to their existing network management system.
And Werner, while we have the opportunity, I also wanted to get your perspective on 2 major trends that are really defining a lot of the coverage that's coming out of RCR and a lot of the talking points that are circulating in the telecom industry. The first one is public safety. Obviously, FirstNet was a huge deal last year, and now the deployment's getting started, so it continues to get a lot of discussion. Also has major implications for in-building wireless. So what's Nextivity doing to support the public safety needs of their customers?
Sean, that's probably, it's a very, in many ways, a frustrating opportunity that's looming for everyone, just because of the speed at which it has evolved from a FirstNet point of view. Obviously, we've reached a critical point now, and everyone is optimistic that going forward, we'll see things happen. But of course, underlying that and, almost unassociated at this point in time with the LTE public safety of FirstNet, is the implication of the 700 and 800 bands, which obviously are key to fire and police and so on and so forth. So the nature of that public safety is as such that to be 100% code compliant in the various jurisdictions, the authorizing jurisdictions, is still somewhat of a conundrum. And, certain authorities in certain legislated states have one way of looking at that, others have other. So right now, there's somewhat of a variability in terms of whether or not someone's product completely complies with the public safety code requirements, or whether or not it partially does. And in many ways, there are products being implemented today that are only partially code compliant. As we move forward, code compliance for the bigger picture of public safety, both the FirstNet LTE implication and then the land mobile radio 700, 800 networks, which are quite different. They're channelized. The channels are very narrow. It requires stringent filtering to prevent any kind of interference. There's, of course, a bigger picture that looms, and how does one integrate all of this under an understood banner where the code compliance is clearly understood, where those issuing code compliance are all of a similar mind. And, that's somewhat in the future. It's years in the future. Our intention as Nextivity is that as we disrupted the smart booster space, as we disrupted the passive DAS space, as we created our sort of hybrid active DAS context to enable installers to be, much more efficient in terms of the way they do things, and therefore be much more competitive in this space. We intend doing the exact same thing in public safety. Today, as of this very moment, we are not shipping a public safety system that is 100% compliant. And but in the new year, we will be doing exactly that. And I think we'll get a chance to chat about that closer to the end of this year. But of course, because of the nature of its locale being inside of a building, it impacts immediately on anyone and any customer, any vendor, any installer that is in the in-building space needs to clearly understand the implications of public safety and, of course, look towards the future in terms of how you address and let's call it confusion, because there is an element of confusion because all the rules aren't clearly understood and all the rules don't apply equally in all jurisdictions. But it is our strong intent to make sure that our product will supersede the implications, the confusion, and thereby create a platform whereupon our installer base today will be able to go out and be 100% code compliant in the various jurisdictions that they will be selling. And I think it's an exciting time for in-building wireless. Public safety as a whole is exciting. And while all of this evolves, of course, AT&T, FirstNet, and Verizon will have a reaction to that too. We'll mature the process and we'll begin to see, public safety installs becoming far more prolific. Of course, today, there are numerous venues that require, permits for occupation. And it goes without saying that, Miami is always a well-mentioned jurisdiction. There are many others where it really is necessary to get a certificate of occupation before anybody can occupy a public space or a leased space or a rented space. And the more and more that becomes a requirement, the more and more public safeties will sort of prevail within environments where, of course, they weren't even considered before.
So public safety, a big priority in 2018 and into 19. And I know another big priority has got to be 5G. When I stopped by during Mobile World Congress, you had a banner up that said 5G readiness. So maybe share your perspective on the development and deployment of 5G that we're seeing in the industry at a high level. And then how does that relate to Nextivity and how you guys move forward?
Right. So we're a company that's really driven by revenue. We tend not to go out too far ahead of ourselves and be forced to tread water. So as one looks at the maturation of devices inside of the 5G world, one realizes that while everyone's speaking about it today, while all operators are making some kind of promise of the end of this year and next year, beginning their aggressive endeavors. The reality is that there's going to be time that elapses before the whole ecosystem is truly ready to deliver generally. At that point in time, that's when we want to be ready with a product. So, what do we think that is? Sometime in 2019, we feel that if we were compliant with 5G towards the end of 2019, we'd still be early. And even if we were a tad later into 2020, I don't believe we lose any market share because ostensibly we're not 5G ready. Of course, there is the sort of 5G readiness, which presupposes that if you're putting in infrastructure and you're laying cable and you're sort of building cities that need to optimize 5G technologies, you are taking a sort of a future-proof look at what one does. We don't need to take as an aggressive future look in terms of smart cities and the likes just yet. So as I say, 2019, in the latter part of 2019, will be more than adequate. If you look at our history, we've come a long way from 3G through 4G, and we timed ourselves really well. We had a 3G product for quite an extended period of time. it really wasn't. It really wasn't capable of scaling to the 4G, speeds and requirements. And we timed our 4G product release very well. And today we have, a significant installed base of 4G product, which we believe will continue. And the only nuance that it might have is that some of the bands that get refarmed would have to be refreshed in our products just to comply with bands which are available to those technologies which aren't today. For example, in the 600 or the 700 megahertz band in the United States. But if you look at sort of our progression along the technology curve, being 2G, 3G, 4G, and 5G, it's easy to kind of see where we are by virtue of the processor, the custom proprietary processor that really is the heart and soul of every Cel-Fi product. It's the device inside of our product which really determines the product's capability. We have significantly tested our 5G capable or compliant chip. It's in our lab, and the very first products that will be coming out in 2019 will actually be hosted by our 5G compliant processor. And then as the market unfolds and presents itself with some degree of, should we say, clarity, we will adapt our products to the 5G requirements, leaning on the 5G core processor that we've already developed. We started development of our 5G processor two and a bit years ago, and it's recently come back from the fab in Japan, and it's now in its test phase, and we're putting it through its paces. So we'll be there and ready when the market's there and ready. And the reason we're that confident about it is we've done it 2 or 3 times before, and I'm sure we should be able to do it this time around as well.
Well, Werner, I really appreciate you taking the time to speak with me about all of those different subjects and how Nextivity plays in them. And like you said, as the market unfolds and we see public safety and 5G get refined, I hope we'll be able to keep up this conversation.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Sean.